Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Ilya Zhestkov. Our story begins not with a scream, but with the heavy, industrial silence of a city suspended in time. We find ourselves in the Soviet city of Saransk during the late 1960s. It is 1967, a year defined by the steady, rhythmic pulse of socialist labor and the biting chill of the Mordovian winter. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the nearby cable factories. The sky is a vast, unblinking expanse of bruised purple and slate gray, hanging low over the rows of uniform apartment blocks that line the streets. In these corridors of concrete, life moved with a predictable, comforting gravity. The world felt smaller then, bound by the edges of the city and the shared breath of communal living. There was a profound sense of security that permeated every kitchen, every hallway, and every dimly lit park. Doors were often left unlocked, not out of negligence, but because the very concept of a predator in their midst was alien, a phantom from another world. The citizens of Saransk walked through the twilight with their heads high, their heavy woolen coats shielding them from the wind, never once looking over their shoulders. The streets of Saransk in 1967 were a tapestry of muted colors and soft, echoing sounds. You could hear the distant, melodic chime of a tram trundling along the tracks, its iron wheels grinding against the frost-dusted rails. You could hear the muffled laughter of children playing in the courtyards, their small hands reddened by the cold as they molded figures out of the heavy, wet snow. Everything had its place. The men returned from the factories at the same hour every evening, their boots creating a steady, collective drumbeat against the pavement. The women stood in short, orderly lines at the kiosks, the steam from their breath mingling with the aroma of fresh black bread and the earthy smell of winter vegetables. It was a time of perceived innocence. To the people of Mordovia, the Soviet Union was a fortress of order, a place where the darkness of the human heart was supposedly managed and contained by the state. Crime was something that happened elsewhere, in the frantic, neon-lit cities of the West, or in the distant, buried pages of history books. Here, in the quiet heart of the province, the night was supposed to be a friend, a blanket that signaled rest and recovery from the day's honest toil. But beneath this surface of collective calm, something was beginning to shift, like a thin crack forming in the ice of a frozen pond. As the calendar turned toward the end of 1967, a subtle change in the atmosphere began to manifest. It was nothing tangible at first, just a feeling, a sudden shiver that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to linger a little longer in the narrow alleyways between the brick warehouses. Perhaps it was the way the wind howled through the birch forests on the outskirts of the city, sounding less like nature and more like a low, mournful warning. Somewhere in the crowd, a figure was moving with a different purpose. Ilya Zhestkov was not yet a name that inspired terror, but he was a presence, a silhouette among many. He was a man who understood the invisibility that the Soviet system provided to the unremarkable. He walked the same streets, breathed the same icy air, and stood in the same shadows as everyone else. But while others looked toward their homes and the warmth of their families, he was looking for the gaps in the armor of the city. He was watching the lonely stretches of road where the streetlights had flickered out, leaving only the pale, ghostly glow of the moon to illuminate the path. He was listening to the silence, waiting for the moment when the rhythm of the city would falter. The peace was finally broken on a Tuesday evening, a night that felt like any other in late 1967. A young girl, no older than 15, had left her music lesson as the sun was dipping below the horizon. She was wearing a bright red scarf, a splash of color against the monochromatic landscape of the city. She was seen walking toward the bus stop, her boots crunching rhythmically on the packed snow, her breath a series of small, white clouds in the freezing air. She never arrived at the apartment where her mother was waiting with a pot of hot tea and a plate of sugar cookies. At first, there was only confusion. Neighbors checked with neighbors, their voices low and urgent in the hallways. The police were notified, but their response was measured, almost dismissive. Girls sometimes stayed late with friends. Teenagers were occasionally impulsive. They told the mother to wait, to keep the tea warm, to stay calm. But as the hours turned into a full day, and then two, a cold, suffocating dread began to spread through the neighborhood. The search parties were organized by the factory workers, men with flashlights and heavy coats who waded through the deep drifts of the suburban woods and peered into the dark corners of industrial yards. The silence of Saransk was no longer a comfort. It had become a vacuum, a hollow space where a life had simply vanished into thin air. The discovery came 3 days later, near the edge of a frozen stream that meandered through the thickets of the birch groves. It was not a grand or dramatic scene, but it was one that would be burned into the memories of those who found it. A single red scarf was caught on the low, thorny branch of a bush, its fabric fluttering weakly in the winter breeze like a dying bird. A few feet away, the snow had been disturbed, churned up and then smoothed over by a fresh dusting of frost. Underneath that layer of white lay the reality that shattered the peace of 1967 forever. The initial discovery was handled with a clumsy, panicked haste. The authorities tried to keep the details quiet, to preserve the illusion of Soviet safety. But the truth was like water, finding every crack and crevice in the community. People began to lock their doors. Parents began to hold their children's hands with a grip that was almost painful. The quiet streets of Saransk were now filled with a new kind of sound, the sound of hushed conversations and the quickened footsteps of those who feared the dark. The city had realized, with a collective, heart-stopping clarity, that a predator was among them. This was only the beginning of the shadow cast by Ilya Zhestkov, a shadow that would stretch far beyond the borders of Mordovia and into the dark annals of history. Breathe deeply now. The world is safe around you, even as we explore the chilling echoes of the past. The investigators stood in a circle around the depression in the snow, their breath rising in heavy, rhythmic plumes of gray against the biting air of 1968. The ground was no longer a blank canvas of white. It had been disrupted by the heavy boots of the militia and the tragic, final stillness of the one they had found. The frozen stream nearby continued its muffled gurgle beneath a thick crust of ice, a sound like glass grinding against glass. For the local authorities in this closed city, the scene was a nightmare of incomprehensible proportions. They looked for the usual signs of a drunken quarrel or a robbery gone wrong, but the silence of the woods offered no such easy answers. The air smelled of sharp pine and the metallic tang of deep winter, a scent that seemed to cling to the wool of their heavy coats as they worked. Every snap of a twig in the distance made a young officer flinch, his hand drifting toward the holster at his hip. There was a sense that the forest itself was a witness, its bare, skeletal branches reaching toward the iron-gray sky like thin fingers frozen in a silent plea for help. Less than a month later, the pattern began to sharpen, etching itself into the consciousness of the town like frost on a window pane. It was the discovery of young Olga Klushina that truly shattered the illusion of safety. She was only 13 years old, a child of the Soviet era with dreams that stretched far beyond the gray concrete of her neighborhood. The details of her disappearance were whispered in the queues at the bread shops and in the back rooms of the communal apartments. People spoke of a man, polite and well-spoken, who had approached her with a promise that sounded like a fairy tale. He claimed to be a director for the prestigious film, No Password Necessary, which everyone knew was being filmed in the area. To a young girl in 1968, the chance to be a star was a shimmering light in a world of monotone routine. She had followed him into the shadows of the woods, her heart likely racing with the thrill of a new life, never suspecting that the naval uniform he wore was not a costume of authority, but a shroud of deception. When they found her, the brutality was unmistakable. The weapon used was not a common kitchen knife, but something specialized, something sharp and cold, a naval dirk that had left precise, devastating marks. The militia struggled to connect the dots, their desks piling high with grainy black and white photographs and handwritten reports that smelled of stale tobacco and ink. In the Soviet Union of 1968, the concept of a serial predator was a foreign ghost, something that belonged to the decadent stories of the West, not the orderly streets of a socialist city. Yet the evidence was becoming undeniable. Another body was found near the 25th kilometer mark, identified as 19-year-old Nina Beregina. She had come to the city with the hope of enrolling in the university, her suitcase filled with notebooks and the quiet ambitions of a student. The attacker had not used a blade this time. Instead, the frost-covered earth was stained where heavy stones had been used to end her life. The killer had taken her blouse and her notebook, small trophies that served no purpose other than to remind him of his power. The investigators noticed a chilling ritual in the way the scene was left. The bodies were not hidden with any great care, as if the killer wanted the frost to preserve his handiwork, turning the victims into statues of ice for the world to find when the morning sun finally broke through the haze. As autumn began to bleed into a true, punishing winter, the tension in the community became a physical weight. The streets of Vladivostok, usually bustling with the movement of sailors and dockworkers, grew unnaturally quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon. The yellow glow of the street lamps seemed weaker, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the brickwork. Mothers held their children's hands with a grip that left marks, and the laughter that once echoed from the schoolyards was replaced by a hurried, anxious silence. Every man in a naval uniform was now a potential shadow, a source of suspicion rather than respect. Inside the dimly lit hallways of the militia headquarters, the pressure was mounting. They were looking for a ghost who moved through the city with the ease of a local, someone who knew the train schedules and the hidden paths through the birch groves. They began to realize that the killer wasn't just striking at random. He was hunting with a method. He was luring them with the same lie, the same promise of cinema and fame, and then leading them to the quietest, coldest places he could find. The patterns in the frost were no longer just a weather phenomenon. They were a map of a predator's territory. The most terrifying realization came with the discovery of Lyubov Strusova, a 19-year-old worker at the railway hospital. Her death was a study in controlled violence. She had been strangled with a length of twine, her hands tied behind her back in a way that suggested the killer took pleasure in the slow progression of the act. But it was the case of Valentina Pasco that truly sent a shiver through the hearts of the seasoned investigators. She was 22 years old, a streetcar driver who knew every corner of the city. When they found her in the outskirts, the killer had done something that defied logic. He had damaged her eyes, a ritualistic act born from a dark, ancient superstition. There was a belief among the criminal underworld that the last image a victim sees remains burned into their retinas like a photograph. By destroying her eyes, the killer was trying to erase his own reflection, to ensure that even in death, his identity remained hidden in the dark. The militia stood over her, the wind howling through the trees like a wounded animal, realizing that they were not just dealing with a murderer, but with a man who lived in a world of twisted shadows and lethal myths. The hunt was no longer just about justice. It was a race against the winter itself, before the snow could cover the tracks of a monster who called himself a director of tragedies. The year 1968 in the closed city of Vladivostok was a tapestry of fog, salt air, and a heavy, pervasive silence. To the world outside, it was a fortress of the Pacific Fleet, a place of steel and secrets where every movement was tracked and every face belonged to someone with a purpose. But beneath this rigid order, a phantom had begun to weave through the shadows of the forest floor and the dimly lit edges of the railway lines. The investigators of the Criminal Investigation Department sat in offices that smelled perpetually of damp wool and the bitter, sharp tang of ozone from old electrical heaters. On their desks, the files grew into towers of gray paper, each page a testament to a growing desperation. They were working in an era where science was a slow, methodical grind. There were no digital databases to cross-reference, no instant alerts to spread across a network. Instead, there were only the rhythmic, clacking keys of heavy iron typewriters and the scratching of fountain pens against rough paper. The air in these rooms felt thick, as if the weight of the unsolved cases was pressing down on the very walls. Detectives would stare at the black and white photographs of the victims until the silver halide grains seemed to shift before their eyes. They were looking for a man who did not seem to exist, a predator who moved with the confidence of a ghost through a city that was supposed to be impenetrable. Forensic science in the late 1960s was a theater of shadows and light. In the dark rooms of the local precinct, the investigators watched as images of the 25th kilometer markers slowly materialized in trays of chemical developer. The smell of acetic acid hung heavy in the air, a sour, stinging scent that clung to their clothes and hair. They studied the crime scenes with a painstaking focus on the minute details that the naked eye might miss in the dim light of the woods. They found the impressions of heavy boots in the damp earth, the crushed ferns where a struggle had occurred, and the chillingly precise marks of a naval dirk. The challenges were immense. Blood typing could only narrow the field so far, and fingerprinting was a labor-intensive process of comparing physical cards against thousands of others by hand. But it was the nature of the crimes themselves that truly haunted the investigators. The discovery of Valentina Pasco, her life stolen in the outskirts of the city, introduced a new, terrifying element to the profile. The killer had used a small tool to gouge out her eyes, a detail so specific and ritualistic that it sent a shiver through even the most hardened officers. It was a superstition born of the prison camps, a belief that the last image seen by the dying remains etched into the retina. This suggested a man who was not just a predator, but one steeped in the dark lore of the criminal underworld, perhaps a man with roots in the harsh realities of the Soviet penal system. As the summer of 1968 bled into a cooling autumn, the investigators began to piece together a psychological portrait of their suspect. They realized that he was hiding in plain sight, using the city's own identity as a shield. At the time, Vladivostok was abuzz with the filming of a major motion picture titled No Password Necessary. It was a well-known event, a rare moment of glamour in the industrial landscape. The killer, with a chillingly calm calculatedness, began to present himself as a movie director. This ruse was brilliant in its simplicity. It explained why a strange man might approach a young woman in public. It provided a reason for him to lead her to secluded, picturesque locations for a supposed screen test. He wasn't a monster lurking in an alleyway. He was a man of culture and opportunity, an authority figure offering a dream. The profile of the ghost began to take on a terrifyingly human shape. He was likely someone with access to naval circles, a man who could wear a uniform without drawing suspicion, yet possessed the smooth tongue of a storyteller. The investigators spoke with surviving witnesses, women like Natalia who had narrowly escaped his grasp. Their descriptions were frustratingly vague, yet they all shared a common thread. They spoke of a man who was unremarkable, someone who blended into the background of the port city like a single wave in the gray expanse of the sea. He was described as having a face that you might see 100 times a day and never remember, a face that was a mask of ordinary civilian life. The pressure on the local authorities was mounting. In a closed military city, the idea of a serial predator was not just a police matter. It was a threat to the perceived security of the state. The detectives worked late into the nights, their only companions the ticking of the wall clocks and the distant, low moan of foghorns from the harbor. They began to map the locations of the attacks, pinning small red markers onto a large topographic map of the region. The clusters formed around the railway lines and the dense, wooded areas near the 25th kilometer. They realized he was mobile, likely utilizing the very transport systems that moved the laborers and sailors of the city. They started to look closer at the items stolen from the victims. It wasn't just money he took, it was their personal belongings. A notebook, a woolen blouse, a small watch. These were trophies, kept or sold, serving as a bridge between his mundane reality and the violence he inflicted. The detectives realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a thief of identities, a man who lived a double life among the ranks of the Pacific Fleet. The realization that the killer might be one of their own, a midshipman or a sailor with a clean record, added a layer of tension to every interaction. Every man in a naval uniform became a potential phantom. Every greeting on the street carried a hidden edge of suspicion. They were hunting a shadow that knew the terrain as well as they did, a man who understood the rhythm of the city and used its own heartbeat to mask his movements. By October of 1968, the profile had solidified. He was a man in his early 20s, likely military, with a history of petty theft and a chilling lack of empathy. The investigators began to scour the disciplinary records of the fleet, looking for anyone who had been caught stealing from their comrades. It was here, in the mundane bureaucracy of the Navy, that the name Ilya Zhestkov first began to surface. He was a midshipman, a man who should have been a guardian of the state, yet his record was peppered with small, persistent crimes. He had stolen 500 rubles from his fellow servicemen, a significant sum that spoke to a reckless disregard for the rules of his brothers in arms. As the detectives dug deeper into Zhestkov's life, they found a history of poverty and a family tree rooted in the very camps he seemed to fear. The ghost was finally gaining a name, a rank, and a history. But as they closed in, the phantom prepared to vanish once more. The hunt moved from the wooded outskirts of Vladivostok to the cold, echoing corridors of military headquarters, as the investigators raced to catch a man who had already proven he could disappear into the fog at a moment's notice. The air in the city felt charged, like the stillness before a massive storm, as the pieces of the puzzle were finally, agonizingly, forced into place. By the middle of October in 1968, the air in Vladivostok had turned sharp and biting, carry the scent of diesel, sea salt, and the heavy, metallic tang of the shipyards. The city was a fortress of industry, a closed world where every movement was regulated by the rhythm of the changing shifts and the heavy clanging of iron gates. The investigation, which had once scoured the quiet forest paths and the outskirts of the railway tracks, began to turn its gaze inward, toward the gray monoliths of the industrial sector. Here, the shadows were deeper, cast by the towering cranes of the Pacific Fleet and the soot-stained walls of the naval repair shops. Detectives moved through these spaces like ghosts, their boots crunching on the cold grit of the factory floors, searching for a face that would fit the terrifying profile they had built. They weren't looking for a monster that lived in the dark, but a man who existed in the plain, daylight world of mechanical labor and military discipline. The killer was not an outsider. He was a cog in the massive machine of the city, hidden behind a mask of mundane service and the rough, grease-stained fabric of a worker's uniform. At the heart of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, the gates operated with a relentless, rhythmic precision. Every morning, thousands of men in dark naval wool streamed through, their breaths blooming in the cold morning air. Among them was a young Mitchman, a man whose presence was as unremarkable as the gray fog rolling off the Golden Horn Bay. His name was Ilya Zhestkov. To his superiors, he was a midshipman of average capability, perhaps a bit prone to petty infractions, but nothing that would suggest the darkness lurking beneath his skin. He spent his days surrounded by the deafening roar of machinery and the rhythmic thumping of heavy presses, an environment where a scream would be swallowed by the cacophony of progress. This industrial camouflage was his greatest weapon. He understood the flow of the city, the way the workers moved, and the specific vulnerabilities of those who lived on its fringes. He had spent months perfecting a persona that was both glamorous and accessible, a sharp contrast to the grime of the factory gates. During that long, gray autumn, a strange truth had permeated the city. A major film production, titled No Password Necessary, was being shot on the streets of Vladivostok. The sight of cameras, heavy lighting rigs, and men in stylish coats was not unusual. Zhestkov, with a chillingly calculated intuition, stepped into this reality. He began to tell young women that he was a movie director, a man searching for the next face of Soviet cinema. It was a ruse that relied on the hopes and dreams of those who wanted to escape the repetitive grind of the factories and the railway hospitals. He didn't need to force them into the shadows. He invited them there under the guise of fame. He would speak of screen tests and cinematic lighting, his voice soft and persuasive against the backdrop of the city's industrial roar. Many of his victims, including 19-year-old Lyubov Strusova and 22-year-old Valentina Pasco, followed him willingly into the woods, believing they were walking toward a brighter future, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of stone and twine. The breakthrough in the case did not come from a sudden moment of forensic brilliance or a witness who escaped. Instead, it emerged from the tedious, dust-covered ledgers of military discipline. While the murder investigators were looking for a predator, the internal auditors of the Naval Department were looking for a thief. Reports began to surface that 7 servicemen had been robbed, their lockers picked clean of hard-earned wages. The total amount was 500 rubles, a significant sum in 1968, enough to buy a lifestyle far beyond the reach of a simple midshipman. When the investigators cross-referenced the names of those recently disciplined for theft with the military profile of the killer, one name stood out in stark, bold letters: Ilya Zhestkov. The detectives realized that the man they were hunting was not just a killer, but a cynical, petty thief who stripped his victims of their belongings as coldly as he stripped them of their lives. He had been stealing from his comrades and his victims alike, hiding the watches, the woolen blouses, and the notebooks of the dead girls within the very naval barracks he called home. As the net began to tighten around the naval yards, Zhestkov felt the shift in the atmosphere. The factory gates, once his shield, now felt like the bars of a cage. The air in the barracks grew heavy with suspicion. He could see the detectives in their long, dark coats standing near the entrance, their eyes scanning the faces of every man who passed through. In a fit of panicked desperation, he abruptly quit the service, claiming family emergencies in Tomsk. He vanished from the city, leaving behind a trail of stolen goods and broken lives. But the investigation had already found its anchor. When they searched his quarters, they didn't just find stolen rubles. They found the artifacts of his atrocities. There, tucked away amongst his military gear, was a notebook belonging to Nina Berezina and a woolen blouse that still smelled faintly of the woods where Olga Klushina had been found. The mundane cover of the industrial worker had finally cracked, revealing the hollow, terrifying reality of the Mitchman killer. The hunt moved across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, but the origin of the lead remained tied to those heavy iron gates in Vladivostok. The gray sky over the Pacific Fleet headquarters hung low, a heavy blanket of charcoal and slate that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of the city. In 1968, the winter air was a sharp, biting thing, carrying the salt of the sea and the metallic tang of shipyard grease. Through this haze, the shadows of men moved with a deliberate, calculated slowness. These were not the usual sailors returning from leave or the dockworkers finishing their shifts. They were the invisible eyes of the state, drifting through the crowds like smoke. They watched the man they had come to know as Ilya Zhestkov. He was a figure of startling normalcy, a midshipman whose presence was as unremarkable as a single stone in a vast fortress wall. As he stepped through the gates, His boots made a rhythmic, crunching sound against the frozen gravel, a sound that, to the ears of the watchers, began to resemble the ticking of a clock. They observed how he adjusted the collar of his naval uniform, a simple, utilitarian garment that smelled faintly of salt and cheap tobacco. There was no tremor in his hands, no furtive glances over his shoulder to betray a conscience burdened by the unthinkable. He was, to all outward appearances, a model of Soviet stability, a quiet gear in the massive machinery of the Navy. The investigators found the contrast between his crimes and his daily life to be a chilling void that they could not easily bridge. In the communal spaces of the naval barracks and the shared corridors of the fleet, Zhestkov was viewed with a respect that bordered on invisibility. He was the man who would hold a heavy steel door open for a colleague, his expression one of mild, helpful detachment. At his post, his supervisors noted his punctuality and his steady hand. There was a terrifying stillness to him, a quality of being a citizen above suspicion that he had cultivated like a garden. As the surveillance intensified throughout the autumn of 1968, the officers followed him through the markets, watching as he carefully selected his supplies with the precision of a technician. The mundanity of his movements was hypnotic. He would sit on a park bench, the cold wind whipping the fallen leaves around his feet, and simply stare at the horizon for an hour, as motionless as a statue. It was in these moments of profound quiet that the investigators felt a deep, primal unease. They were looking at a man who had mastered the art of being nobody, even while he harbored the memories of the naval dirk he had used to extinguish the lives of the innocent. The mask he wore was crafted from the very fabric of his environment. In the city of Vladivostok, a place often closed to the outside world, he moved with the confidence of a man who belonged. He had reinvented himself as a director for a film titled No Password Necessary, a ruse that allowed him to walk among the public not as a predator, but as a creator of dreams. He would approach young women with a soft, practiced invitation, promising them a place in the spotlight, while the darkness within him waited for the sun to set. The surveillance teams noted how easily people trusted the midshipman in the crisp uniform. They watched as he spoke to strangers, his gestures fluid and non-threatening, his voice a soothing melody in the harsh industrial landscape. But beneath the polished brass buttons and the official rank, the investigators had discovered a history of petty thefts and small cruelties. 500 rubles stolen from his fellow servicemen, a string of disciplinary reports that painted a picture of a man who felt he was entitled to whatever he could take. The net was tightening, not because of a single grand mistake, but because the small cracks in his ordinary life were beginning to spiderweb under the pressure of the truth. The decision to move in was made in the freezing heart of November. Zhestkov, perhaps sensing the shift in the air or the lingering gaze of a stranger in a gray coat, abruptly left the naval service and fled toward the interior, toward Tomsk. The chase was silent and swift. On the 18th of November, 1968, the air was brittle with frost as the authorities finally converged on his location. There was no grand, cinematic confrontation. The heavy hands of the law fell upon his shoulders in the dim light of a cramped room, and Zhestkov simply stopped. He allowed his arms to be pulled back, his body sagging slightly as if a great tension had finally been released from his frame. The clink of the metal restraints was the only sharp sound in the room, a cold, clinical ring that signaled the end of his dual existence. As they led him away, the interior light of the building spilled out onto the snow, illuminating his face for a fleeting second. His eyes were not those of a monster in the throes of madness, but rather the flat, empty eyes of a man who had long ago checked out of the human experience. He looked not at the men who held him, but at the shadows dancing on the edge of the light. When the investigators entered his private quarters, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps on the wooden floor. It was a room that smelled of old wool and stale bread, the the sanctuary of a midshipman who had lived within the rules of the state. But as they began to search, the ordinary vanished. Tucked away behind mundane items, they found the trophies of his darkness. They discovered a small, delicate ribbon from a girl's hair, a tarnished button from a coat, and a woolen blouse that still held the faint, lingering scent of a life cut short. Most haunting of all was his naval dirk, the polished blade a silent witness to the 14 wounds he had inflicted upon a fellow sailor earlier that May. As the officers catalogued these items, the jarring contrast of the room became unbearable. The official naval papers sitting on a desk right next to the stolen notebooks of his victims. Zhestkov had not lived 2 lives. He had lived one life where the horror was woven so tightly into the normal that they were indistinguishable. In the cold light of the interrogation room that followed, he began to speak in a voice that was soft and rhythmic, describing his crimes as if he were reciting a technical manual. The citizen above suspicion had finally been unmasked, leaving behind a silence that the naval yards would never truly be able to fill. The courtroom in Vladivostok was a cavern of shadows and heavy, unyielding wood. It was late in the year 1968 when the weight of the Soviet state finally settled upon the shoulders of Ilya Zhestkov. Outside, the air was a biting, salt-crusted gale that whipped against the stone walls of the military tribunal, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. The scent of floor wax and damp wool hung thick in the air, a heavy perfume of bureaucracy and quiet dread. As you imagine the scene, breathe in the cold, metallic tang of the radiator pipes and the faint, dry smell of old paper. The judge sat behind a high bench of dark oak, his face a landscape of deep lines and unblinking discipline. There were no cameras here, no flashes of light to document the fall of the man they called the director. There was only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a heavy clock on the back wall, sounding like a slow heartbeat in the hollow chest of justice. Every few seconds, the scratch of a fountain pen on parchment would punctuate the silence, as a clerk recorded the official end of a reign of terror that had gripped the closed city in a silent vice. The floorboards groaned beneath the weight of the armed guards, their boots polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dim, amber glow of the overhead chandeliers. In this space, time seemed to stretch, thin and fragile, as the world waited for the monster to speak. When Ilya Zhestkov stood to address the court, he did not look like a predator. He wore the uniform of a Navy warrant officer, the fabric crisp and the buttons catching the low light. His voice was not a snarl, but a soft, terrifyingly calm monotone. He spoke of his motives with a chilling detachment, as if he were describing the plot of a film he had only watched from a distance. He detailed how he had used the allure of the cinema, the promise of a role in the grand production of Password Not Needed, to lure his victims into the woods. He described the way the light changed in the forest near the 25th kilometer, and how the silence of the trees was the only audience he ever truly desired. He confessed to the 5 lives he had extinguished, his words falling like stones into a deep, dark well. He spoke of the first victim, a fellow sailor, killed in a fit of drunken rage that had unlocked a dark, hidden door within his soul. From there, the transition into the persona of the director had been seamless. He enjoyed the power of the lie, the way a simple promise of fame could make a person walk willingly into the shadows. As he spoke, his hands remained steady, resting on the railing of the dock. He did not ask for mercy, nor did he show the slightest tremor of regret. To him, the victims were merely characters in a script he had written for himself, and the trial was simply the final act he was forced to endure. The sentence was delivered with the swift, surgical precision characteristic of the Soviet era. In 1968, there was little room for the complexities of psychological trauma or the nuances of a fractured mind. The state saw only a broken gear in the machine, a malfunction that required immediate and permanent removal. The judge's voice was a low rumble, echoing off the high ceiling as he pronounced the words that would seal Zhestkov's fate. Death by shooting. The finality of the sentence hung in the air, thick and heavy as velvet curtains. There would be no lengthy appeals, no decade of waiting on a row of cells. In the eyes of the law, Ilya Zhestkov had already ceased to exist. He was led away from the dock, the sound of his footsteps fading down the stone corridor, swallowed by the immense silence of the prison beneath the courthouse. For months afterward, he remained in a cell where the only light came from a small, barred window high above, casting a single, dusty beam onto the cold concrete floor. He waited there as the seasons turned, a ghost among the living, while the state prepared to carry out the ultimate penalty. The secrecy of the process was absolute. The public was told little, and the families of the victims were left to find their own peace in the shadow of a justice that was as cold as the Siberian winter. The execution took place in the early months of 1971, within the gray, windowless walls of the Vladivostok Detention Center. It was a quiet affair, conducted in the pre-dawn hours when the city was still wrapped in sleep. There were no witnesses other than the officials required by law. The sound of a single volley of gunfire was muffled by the thick stone, a brief punctuation mark at the end of a dark and twisted story. For decades that followed, the name Ilya Zhestkov was whispered only in the corridors of the local archives, or by the survivors who could never truly forget the face of the man who offered them a dream and gave them a nightmare. The Soviet state, ever protective of its image of order and safety, allowed the case to fade into the fog of history. The files were locked away, the details obscured by the passage of time and the changing of regimes. It wasn't until much later, after the walls had fallen and the secrets of the past were allowed to breathe, that the full scope of the director's crimes came to light. Even now, when we look back at the documents and the grainy photographs of a young man in a sailor's cap, a sense of lingering mystery remains. The motives he claimed, the coldness of his heart, and the swiftness of his end serve as a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a polite smile and a convincing lie. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.